He received permission to read the case from personal notes written on a single sheet of yellow paper. Kennedy slumped in his chair with his eyes shut. Arena dropped his summary in mid-recital. He spent several seconds crouched on the floor of the witness stand retrieving the document. More than one reporter in the courtroom thought the incident symbolized Arena's handling of this case. I mean, this is such a poetic moment. It's a picture of everything that's happened with Arena, him literally dropping the case. Good morning. Welcome back to my channel, and if you are new with us, then welcome. I hope I can earn your subscription. Today we are continuing our move through Leo Damore's book, Chappaquiddick, an investigative look into the power, privilege, and the Ted Kennedy cover-up that happened on the island of Chappaquiddick in 1969. We have been through the early stages of just the car being found, the investigation of Mary Jo's body, which was not very detailed. We will add several important procedures were not done, besides which they did not do an autopsy. There's actually going to be some more discussion of the autopsy in today's episode. We also got to see Ted Kennedy go to the police station at 10 a.m. the next day, even though the accident happened sometime between 11:30 and 1 a.m., depending on who you believe. And we got to see all the inner workings of the Kennedy compound. The primary thing you need to know if you're just joining us is that one close member of Ted Kennedy's family and the party that day, Joey Gargan, was the primary source for this book. And so as we go through, anything attributed to him is a first-hand account that either he told to the author or that the author researched and then Joey verified personally, because they worked together for quite some time before the book was published. And so let's go ahead and get into today's reading. Chapter 28 is where we're starting today. It says, Arena was finally going to question Jack Crimmins. Crimmins, you'll remember, was the chauffeur for Kennedy. They would have raucous fights with one another. They had a really surly relationship between Senator Kennedy and Jack Crimmins, but Jack Crimmins was his nighttime and weekend chauffeur. Crimmins met the delegation at the door of his room at the Catamaran Motel. Arena regretted not having spoken to Kennedy's chauffeur on Saturday morning. Yes, right after Kennedy comes in to report the accident, Crimmins is kind of hanging around the police station, almost like he wanted to be interviewed that day. And then he gets spooked and he heads out and Arena doesn't do it. And he didn't think about it before the chance was gone. He said, I thought, gee, that would have been a great feather in my cap because right from the beginning, I might have had an idea what the hell had gone on the night before. Yeah, Arena, that would have been nice. He didn't do that with anybody. He always was getting caught back on his heels. Crimmins had come to the police station to talk to Arena, but spotted a Newsweek reporter in the corridor he didn't like and left. Crimmins was now suspiciously eager to cooperate. Here's a guy who's going to say, we've got the interview with him, so we don't have to bother anyone else who was at the party. That's what Arena begins to think. He asks Crimmins, what can you tell us about the night of the accident? Do you mind if I write it? Crimmins asked. A statement was better than an interrogation, in Arena's opinion. So they all stand around while Jack writes out his statement in longhand. And y'all, this just makes me so angry. This is another instance of Arena either not being a good detective or not seeking responsibility for digging, which is where I'm starting to get with this guy, because he has somebody there. And what do you mean a statement is better than an interrogation? I mean, maybe you start with a statement, but then you poke holes and then you seek and you think about whether it's, got internal logic and whether the events make any sense at all. He doesn't do that. Let's listen to his statement. My name is John D. Crimmins. I live at such and such. On July 18th, 1969, I was on Chappaquiddick at a cottage rented by Joseph Gargan where a cookout was held for girls who had worked for the Robert Kennedy campaign. There were 12 people present, myself, and then he lists everyone. Kennedy, Markham, Treader, Joey Gargan, Ray LaRosa, the deceased, he means Mary Jo, Susan Tannenbaum, Rosemary Keogh, Esther Newberg, Mary Ellen and Nancy Lyons. It was a friendly party. The group was reminiscing and discussing politics. There was liquor available. One thing I noticed is that in the list of people, it does not use the word only. It just says there were 12 people present. And whenever I'm looking at a statement like this, I look for things where there's wiggle room, where there's any possibility that they're only telling us partly true things, not the complete and whole truth and nothing but the truth, right? But he lists out, he just says there were 12 people present. And my brain immediately goes to, well, do you mean at 9 p.m.? Do you mean at 7 p.m.? Do you actually mean from this time past the time that she was deceased, there were only 12 people? There's no word only in there. So that's what stood out to me about that part of the statement. He says it was a friendly party. They were reminiscing, discussing politics, and there was liquor available. He tells the time that they ate at the steaks came off the grill. At about 11:15 p.m., Senator Kennedy asked me for the keys to the car so he could get back to Edgartown. So that has clearly been coordinated with the senator. He was perfectly normal at that time. There was nothing unusual about his appearance or behavior. Now, I just want to point out the usual way that Senator Kennedy presented himself, particularly at 11:15 on a Saturday night, probably would have been drunk as a skunk. And so this statement doesn't say he appeared to be entirely in his right mind without even the slightest influence of alcohol or any other substance. It doesn't say that. It says he was perfectly normal. There was nothing unusual. Yeah, it could totally be true for somebody who is a known drunk, who acts out in ridiculous and misogynistic, ugly ways. Immediately thereafter, the car pulled away from the front of the house. I first learned of the accident the following morning. Okay. Irina didn't ask why he hadn't driven the senator, how much Kennedy had to drink, what time the senator returned to the cottage, or if he did, or if Crimmins knew about it, or why Crimmins hadn't been told about it until the next morning. Very odd. We've got more things that Irina's flubbing. And you would think by this point in the story, if he wanted to do things properly, if he cared about, if he was already seeing, oh, I didn't ask enough back there, then before chauffeur ever walks in the door, Irina's already got a list of questions. Irina's already thinking through, what are the things I need to make sure I ask him? What are the things that he could have observed that I need to probe about? We don't see an Irina who is actually self-assessing, who actually had already regretted. I think some of this could be, Monday morning quarterbacking, where Irina in interviews after the fact is saying, oh, I really did regret that. I really did. It slipped away, but then by the time I realized I hadn't asked, I just felt terrible. But did he actually in the moment? You remember that Irina had been having double press conferences every day, and people had started really and kind of saying like, hey, hold back, quit giving everything away. So now he's a little bit reticent, and he doesn't tell everyone that he's finally questioned one of the partygoers. I mean, for days they had been saying, oh, the DA's in talks, or the DA's looking into it. So for him to admit it now that it was just one would actually look pretty slipshod, I think. The Crimmins interview was a transparent effort to allay suspicion that the party had been a riotous affair. The statement certainly seemed to be one that would cover everything, Irina said. Here's somebody who was at the party saying it was nice. Everybody was sociable. In other words, he's corroborating Ted's account. The Kennedy lawyer, Dick McCarran, had just received a telephone call from Clark asking him to draft a statement waiving the senator's right to a hearing to contest Irina's complaint application. It was plain that the senator's decision could wait no longer. The legal things are heating up. The reporters are bringing too many questions, and it becomes clear to the Kennedy compound we have to act fast. The compound planning sessions were like a parody of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Life magazine said. All they had to account for was the classic rich kid's stunt, running away from an accident that dad can fix with the judge. Even Clark was unhappy. Reputations such as his were not made by clients pleading guilty. It's what lawyers traditionally do, Dick McCarran agreed, plead to a lesser charge in hopes of avoiding a more serious one. So the local lawyer, who's a bit less hoity-toity, is saying, well, this is what we do. We plead to a lesser charge so that we can get the one written off. But Clark is saying, I'm in this to make a good reputation for myself, not to go in and, represent someone who's going to just admit to the whole thing. Clark arranged to go to Edgartown on a chartered plane to work out the details of Kennedy's court appearance with Arena and Steele. Arena agreed to meet Clark in a vacant office at Martha's Vineyard. It was at this meeting, he said, that they threw the bomb at us. So that's Arena saying that the lawyers are throwing a bomb at them. Senator Kennedy was going to waive the hearing and face arraignment on the charge of leaving the scene. Clark said, how would you feel about pleading guilty and asking for probation? Copping a plea was fine with Steele, but he thought the idea of a U.S. senator on probation was an absurd one. Clark proposed a plea and a suspended sentence. He says they should go to court first thing in the morning. We'll waive our rights to a hearing, make our plea, and get the hell out before anybody knows what's happening. So that's Kennedy's lawyers making this proposal. The idea made sense to Arena, provided that he could arrange police protection that fast. So he gets going on that. Arena is calling in reinforcements from other island police forces when Walter Steele comes in and says, we forgot to tell the judge. So Steele calls the court clerk, Tommy Teller. No cases were docketed for the next morning. Boyle wasn't scheduled. He was off island visiting relatives, not due to return until evening. Boyle refused to discuss the matter over the phone when Teller calls him. He didn't sound taken with the idea of arraigning Senator Kennedy the next morning. Why should we put the case down for any date that they ask for? He asks. Good question. Why should you participate? Why should you roll over and say, sure, whatever you need, I'm here for you? Steele gives Clark the bad news. We don't know if Judge Boyle will sit tomorrow. He instructs the others to stay clear and to keep quiet so that the windows and doors don't get additional reporter attention. If reporters learned that the senator's lawyers were secretly meeting with the chief of police and county prosecutor, then everything would be on the news wires within an hour. Arena, we're told, would be giving a summary of the facts in the court. And Clark says, would you go ahead and put that summary of facts together now? So Arena goes into another room and uses Steele's typewriter to bang out a statement. I don't know how good or normal this is in comparison to what would normally happen in legal wrangling. So if you've been a lawyer, a paralegal, or you've been familiar with that world, would you just let me know what you think? Is this normal that the police chief would be giving the defendant's lawyer a typed out statement of what he was going to present in court? Is that normal? I mean, if there's an arraignment that's being arranged, then would there be some level of agreement between the two parties or not? I could see it both ways. I could see that, well, if you're going to agree to everything, then I've got to tell you what we're going to say. But I could also see like the need of justice to be, well, you defend your client, I'll present what I know, and we're not going to tell you what we're going to say until we get there. I don't know. You let me know. He says, he bangs out this statement, and then I was very pleased my initial preparation was acceptable to everyone. It was word for word the same testimony I gave in the morning in court. Steele returns at 9 o'clock with good news for their party. Boyle would hear the case first thing in the morning. Although it would undermine security arrangements, it was decided to hold a press conference to announce the senator's arraignment. There was no way Ted Kennedy could be sneaked in and out of Edgartown District Court without any reporters seeing. McCarran plans to deliver the statement that he had written, but develops last-minute stage fright I mean, he's just a local lawyer, so he's not used to all this national attention. And you can imagine just a bank of cameras in front of your face. So he's like, no, I'm not ready for this. So he does not go out. Judge Clark did. He said, I've got a brief announcement to make. I cannot elaborate on it. This is it. I can say no more. Reads the statement. Kennedy's decision to face arraignment came as a complete surprise, Arena told reporters. When the reporters wanted to know if Steele had served as an assistant DA for Suffolk County with Ted Kennedy in 1961 and what their relationship was, Steele explodes. That's true. And if you're going to ask questions like that, you can leave. So Steele and Ted Kennedy have a previous relationship that we haven't been told about until now. 8 years later, Steele is helping arrange this deal. Steele sat up until 3 a.m. selecting the press pool that would get to attend in the courtroom and preparing his appearance in court the next morning. After the press conference, Clark calls the court reporter. And Donegan knows why Clark wants Ted's arraignment taken by a court reporter the next morning. He says, quote, if a lawyer had a serious case in the district court, he'd always get a stenographer to have a permanent record. What they want that for is to study the Commonwealth's case to prepare their defense for a superior court trial, if there is one. So he knows this is an important case, and that's why they want a court reporter. Donegan agreed to be in Edgartown the following morning. McCarran, the local lawyer for Ted Kennedy, receives a phone call from Joe Gargan to go to Oak Bluffs and await the arrival of attorney John Driscoll. Gargan had suggested that Driscoll go to Edgartown to coordinate the senator's appearance the next morning. Gargan, you remember, was normally the one. He had done all of the prep work for Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign. When he would go into a stop, Gargan did all the advance work to make sure that things were arranged security-wise, all the hotels were booked, anything that was needed was secured in advance of the senator's arrival. Now he's doing that job, or has been doing that job, for Kennedy, for Ted Kennedy. He's not doing that job here because he was out of favor insofar as Kennedy's staff was concerned. In addition, nobody wants Gargan, who was a witness to the party, just hanging around, with police and reporters. Gargan accompanies Driscoll on his voyage across the Vineyard Sound, but he says he did not discuss the accident with him. Driscoll's dropped off at the dock, and he's checking the route that Kennedy was to travel to the courthouse the next morning, but it's too foggy. Edgartown is shrouded in a gray mist and uncomfortably warm when Arena walks to Town Hall at 8 a.m. The number of newsmen gathered in front of the courthouse and the tiers of television cameras ranked across the street made him uneasy. It was impossible to provide absolute protection for Ted Kennedy. Senator Kennedy, his wife, and Stephen Smith boarded the Marlin at Hyannisport for the hour-long crossing through the fog and heavy seas to Martha's Vineyard. McCarran met his client for the first time when the Marlin docked at Oak Bluffs. Now that's interesting. McCarran was that local lawyer that was secured by Hannafy getting Clark and Clark getting McCarran. And so McCarran is just meeting his client for the first time. Normally at this point, if you have somebody representing you, you would have talked to them, gotten a statement, made sure you knew their situation backwards and forwards. He's never talked to him, never met him. Kennedy looked grim and tense. He wore a blue suit and a dark tie, but had left his cervical collar at home. A detachment of state police escorted him to Edgartown. So the summary for Chapter 28 is that Arena's questioning of Crimmins was actually Crimmins just writing a statement. No questions were asked. Clark and McCarran float the plea deal with Arena and Steele. Judge Boyle wasn't scheduled and wasn't keen, but agrees to the arraignment hearing the next morning. A court reporter is arranged. Key players get to Edgartown by boat during a heavy mist. And Ted, Joan, and Stephen Smith, who is Ted's brother-in-law, married to Jean, arrive together. Chapter 29. This is Friday, 6 days after the accident. When Kennedy entered the courthouse, Arena presented him with a forthwith summons, making his appearance in court official. The senator was taken to the probation office to fill out an identity card required of all defendants. Then he met with his lawyers. Clark had received no assurance that Judge Boyle would go along with the suspended sentence. "I never had a case like this," Clark said later. "I didn't know a single thing about that judge, and I didn't know what he was going to do. He could have sent my client to jail." McCarran was concerned about the mandatory 20-day jail term in all cases of leaving the scene of an accident where personal injury had occurred. Boyle was a stickler for strict construction of statutory commandments when it came to sentencing. Kennedy tries to put him at ease, telling him, "Don't worry about it, he's already made up his mind." Boyle wasn't likely to make a precipitous decision from the bench. Now, I wonder, why is Ted Kennedy certain of this? And I think that Leo Damore, in just giving us these facts, he's told us that the judge was reticent and then agreed, and they're just informed about it. And now we're being told that Ted Kennedy feels certain that the decision has already been made. So this leads me to believe that there has been some direct communication between Judge Boyle and Kennedy's camp. There's not evidence presented for this in here, but it's the absence of what's not being said that makes me think this. To me, there's no logical reason why a nervous Ted, who's been a wreck for days and days and days, hasn't been communicating with people, hasn't been a part of any of the discussions, but suddenly he is sure that this judge has already made his decision, and he's reassuring the lawyer of that. The only way that's possible to me is if he has knowledge through one of those Kennedy compound guys. All eyes observe the senator walking slowly up to a captain's chair. Harvey Ewing contrasts the fast-stepping Ted Kennedy that he had photographed on Saturday morning with the beaten man he sees in the courtroom Friday morning. Kennedy looked whipped, he said. He looked like, "There's one senator that should have gone down with the car." The Methodist church bell next door tolls, and Kennedy flinches when a bailiff bangs the gavel. Judge James Boyle enters the courtroom. He was a tall man with a thinning ridge of red hair, a mustache, and a ruddy complexion. Judge Boyle settles himself down behind a raised oak desk. Court clerk Tommy Teller calls the first case on the docket, and I believe the only case on the docket, Commonwealth versus Edward M. Kennedy. This complaint charges that Edward M. Kennedy of Boston, Massachusetts, on the 19th day of July 1969 at Edgartown, did operate a certain motor vehicle upon a public way in said Edgartown and did go away after knowingly causing injury to Mary Jo Kopechne without stopping and making known his name, residence, and the number of his motor vehicle. I just want to point out that it says the 19th day, so that means they are going with Huck Looks time. They don't put it at 11:15 on the 18th. They put it after midnight on the 19th. There is that decisive word. Teller addressed Kennedy directly. "How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty?" After a week of bated breath with reporters wishing for more information, even the Kennedy compound guys not hearing directly from Ted, most of them having not talked to him directly, this was a climactic moment. Everyone was waiting. Kennedy hesitated, looked at his attorneys. His lips moved, but no sound came. "Guilty," he said, in a choked, near whisper, hardly audible. He swallowed hard, then repeated in a louder but shaking voice, "Guilty." As was his custom, Boyle wanted to hear a summary of his evidence. Arena was sworn. He received permission to read the case from personal notes written on a single sheet of yellow paper. Kennedy slumped in his chair with his eyes shut. Arena dropped his summary in mid-recital. He spent several seconds crouched on the floor of the witness stand retrieving the document. More than one reporter in the courtroom thought the incident symbolized Arena's handling of this case. I mean, this is such a poetic moment. It's a picture of everything that's happened with Arena, him literally dropping the case, him literally not having the information he needs in front of him. This is a perfect picture of what has been happening for 6 days, of Arena just constantly not having the information he needs and dropping pieces that he ought to have been able to secure. Boyle had a question. Peering over his glasses, he said in a harsh voice, "I would be most interested in determining from the defendant or the Commonwealth if there was a deliberate effort to conceal the identity of the defendant." Now, this is the judge asking, did he try to keep us from knowing that he had been the driver? The question encapsulates all the speculation that had made people wonder, why was there a 10-hour difference? Arena looks confused. "Identity of the defendant," he said. "Not to my knowledge, Your Honor." Boyle had addressed his question to the defendant or the Commonwealth. Senator Kennedy chose not to respond to this question. Everyone in the courtroom knew that only he could answer it. If Boyle asks Ted the question directly, Ted would be required to answer or to plead the Fifth Amendment to avoid self-incrimination. But Boyle lets the question go. He said, "I should be glad to hear you gentlemen on disposition." It was an incredible gaffe. If Boyle wanted to find out what Kennedy had done in the hours after the accident, this was his chance. McCarran says shakily, "The attorney's legal defenses that could be presented in this case," Boyle cuts him off. So McCarran thinks he's calling for, go ahead and give me your excuses. Give me your reasons why Kennedy wasn't the guy. And Boyle cuts him off. He says, "I don't think that's a proper statement to make. On a plea of guilty, that's a confession." He's saying you're pleading guilty. "I don't think you should argue that there are legal defenses." So Boyle is being a pushover in one side by not asking Kennedy directly. But over here, he is not letting him off by saying you can present whatever you want in this court. This court is for a guilty plea. He says, "Don't come in here with your posturing. Don't come in here giving all the reasons why you didn't do it when you're here to admit that you did." Senator Kennedy was adamant in his wish to plead guilty. McCarran says, "I believe his character is well known to the world. We would therefore ask that any sentence that the court may impose be suspended." Steele proposes incarceration in the House of Correction for 2 months. Having in mind the character of the defendant, his age, and reputation prior to the accident, Steele says the ends of justice would best be served were he given a suspended sentence. Now that's interesting to me because it makes me wonder, why would you go for 2 months and then suspend when the law says 20 days minimum? Why wouldn't you just say, I'm asking for the 20 days minimum, and also we're asking for a suspended sentence? Why up the ante to 2 months, but then back off the entire thing entirely? That doesn't make sense to me. And the connection that we've been told that Steele had with Kennedy for at least 8 years could explain this. Boyle asks the chief probation officer, there's no record? And under a Charlottesville, Virginia dateline, remember, he has an intense prior traffic record. And the Associated Press had circulated a story that morning in their newspapers listing Ted Kennedy's record of previous traffic offenses. So you can see why them having a hasty trial was important for all these things to line up exactly the way they did, because reporters have uncovered the Virginia traffic offenses. They've published them in the Associated Press, which goes out to newspapers across the nation. And yet, this trial is happening at 9:30 in the morning, and not every paper has been read, at least by Tyra. "None, Your Honor," she says. Boyle paused. The courtroom held its collective breath. Clark calls this the longest moment of my life, waiting for the judge to announce his decision. Considering the unblemished record of the defendant, and insofar as the Commonwealth represents that this is not a case where he was really trying to conceal his identity, it was Boyle's understanding that Kennedy has already been and will continue to be punished far beyond anything this court can impose. the ends of justice would be satisfied by the imposition of the minimum jail sentence and suspension of that sentence, assuming the defendant accepts. McCarran wastes no time. The defendant will accept the suspension, Your Honor. Kennedy stood up. Teller says, Edward M. Kennedy, on the complaint, the court has found you guilty and has sentenced you to serve 2 months in the House of Corrections at Barnstable. Sentence is suspended. Boyle adjourned. The proceeding had taken 7 minutes. I think it's taken longer for you and I to talk through what happened than the actual time in court. Kennedy, his wife, and Stephen Smith were led by 2 state troopers down a back staircase. Kennedy paused to confront a corps of reporters shouting questions. Kennedy ignored those questions. He said, I have made my plea and have requested time on the networks tonight to speak to the people of Massachusetts and the nation. State troopers shouldered through the crowd to allow the senator to reach a car parked at the curbside, which sped off to Martha's Vineyard Airport. A chartered airplane was waiting for their return flight to Hyannisport. So, Chapter 29, we are now almost a week after the accident. Judge Boyle, known as a stickler for the rules, but yet Ted seems confident in the outcome. Why? That's what stood out to me. Ewing, who took that photograph of Ted getting off the boat on Saturday morning, sees him on Friday morning and says Ted looked like a beaten man. Ted pleads guilty. Arena reads the evidence but drops papers midway through. McCarran tried to finesse and say more, but the judge shuts him off. Steele proposes 2 months with a suspended sentence. Judge Boyle did ask about Ted Kennedy's record, but was wrongly informed that it was clear. Now, that's not to say that the person who gave him that report knew. This probation officer certainly could have been preparing her case and making sure all her ducks were in a row that morning and not read the latest papers. But the latest papers did contain Ted Kennedy's Virginia record, which was not entered into this outcome at all. The whole thing took 7 minutes, and Ted announces that he will speak to networks tonight, then flies back to Hyannisport. Chapter 30. Anticipating the outrage of the reporters who expected more facts coming out of the hearing, but having received no more than Arena's truncated version of the case, which they already knew, Steele, Teller, and Arena are now inside the courthouse, struggling to figure out what they are going to do from here. The court clerk, Tommy Teller, urges the police chief, you go out and tell them that it's over. Arena says, well, nobody else would go out. That's how I ended up in front of the television cameras again. He's a little bit embarrassed at this point of his magnetism toward the cameras. He says to the reporters, we've prosecuted on the facts that we have, and there's no additional facts warranting further investigation. I'm satisfied I did my job, and the case is closed. He says, I honestly thought the whole thing would be over, that this speech would be the end of it. He returns to the police station, talks with reporters, and just tried to relax. Walter Steele thought justice had been done. The haste with which the case had been disposed of, the appearance that this was a show trial, combined with a guilty plea that precluded cross-examination or the bringing of any evidence, smacked of a deal worked out in advance of the court appearance by Kennedy. Steele refused to speculate about the questions that remained unanswered. Presumably, Senator Kennedy would address those mysteries in the speech, I'm sure. Senator Kennedy had been urged to defend the charge against him, McCarran revealed. It was his decision, and his decision alone, to plead guilty. Suspension of a mandatory sentence was not legal, says George Killen's friend, Falmouth attorney Frank Keating. The statute called for no less than 20 days on all cases. That meant if you gave any sentence at all, it's got to be a minimum 20 days in jail. You can't give 2 months and then suspend. Helen Tyra, that probation officer that read out that there had been no other driving record, she's in charge of overseeing probation appearances with various people who are sentenced to probation. She says Kennedy's reporting dates were a private matter, just like anyone else, reached on an individual basis. He had to report in by letter, by phone, or in person. That doesn't seem very like you're on a very tight rope. Tyra refused to disclose how often she would require Kennedy to do so during his year's probation. Ordinarily, convicted persons were forbidden from leaving the court's jurisdiction during that time, but she noted, Senator Kennedy will be free to travel at will. Gwen Kopechne was now looking forward to Senator Kennedy's broadcast. She says, quote, I'm waiting for him to discuss his part publicly. There are a few things that happened that haven't been cleared up to the public yet. She tells reporters she would take further action if Senator Kennedy did not clarify these points. She says, I know there's a lot of sick people in the world, and maybe we should expect a little vicious mail. If we can't clear up all the little snide remarks and everything, I would have an autopsy performed if that's the only way I can clear my daughter. So she's getting inferences that sexual relationship was on the table, and I believe people are raising the issue that perhaps Mary Jo was pregnant. An autopsy would be able to clear up whether or not she was pregnant, for sure. Her only interest in the case was the light in which Mary Jo's character and background was being shown. To be clear, the book doesn't mention that that was her motivation in this moment, but that's what I think. It does say her only interest in the case was the light in which Mary Jo's character and background was being shown. With the case disposed of in district court, a most curious ritual occurred at the Registry of Motor Vehicles. Judge Clark personally turned over Senator Kennedy's license to Registrar Richard McLaughlin. Where the license came from was neither explained nor questioned. The senator had not been able to produce a license, we remember, at the police station, and David Burke, his administrative assistant, had not found one in Kennedy's car in Washington, D.C. The license was simply mailed to registry headquarters. That a license renewal had been found in the tab room aroused Inspector Joseph Molino's suspicions. He said, I was surprised. I had a file card in my hand. I had no reason to look anywhere else. I didn't figure there was any other card because after 5 months, I wouldn't be looking for one. Anything I might find in the tab room couldn't be there more than 2 or 3 weeks. Remember, it had been 5 months that Ted Kennedy's license had been expired. And these little tab room cards would sit for 2 or 3 weeks before they got filed. And he's saying, when I went to look for the card, it wasn't there. And so it shouldn't have been here because these only stick around for 2 to 3 weeks. Molino had been alone in the radio room when he had checked Kennedy's license, and he hadn't seen anyone else in the building that night. But a while later, I heard talk going around that McLaughlin was there on Saturday night. It wouldn't take much for someone to key punch a new license to spare the senator the embarrassment of not having one. McLaughlin denied that the senator's license had expired, but then he dismissed the issue as not relevant to the accident anyway. So, when somebody does this, when they say, I didn't do this, but even if I did, it doesn't matter. Somebody who's not guilty doesn't need to say the second part. They just say, I didn't do it. I don't know what happened. I don't know how that happened. I wasn't a part of it. They're very clear, very specific, and very short. They don't go on and on and on and add all this logic, all this extra embellishment. But he does. And then he argues the expiration of a license of a person who's had one for a long time is not an indication of his inability to operate a motor vehicle. So he's saying this doesn't actually give any evidence to whether or not he can drive well anyway. So what does it matter? That the license had expired and that fact had been concealed by the registry was confirmed later when Hank Jonah telephones Assistant DA Jimmy Smith. Now, Gargan had not known that the senator was driving on an expired license at the time of the accident, but he wasn't surprised to learn later that this had been the case. He says, Jack Kennedy often drove with an expired license. So did Bobby. It doesn't make it any better, of course. Ted probably just forgot to have his license renewed. McLaughlin claimed that registry records showed that Kennedy had applied for renewal on February 6th, 1969. Here, Joey Gargan is a witness that helps us discern whether or not this is true again. Kennedy had been in Massachusetts on February 6th. He was on campaign business, and Gargan was in charge of that advance work that happened that day. He says, "We never went near the registry." Back and forth to the compound, Gargan on occasion said only a brief hello to Ted Kennedy. He was pointedly excluded from the strategy sessions. The senator did not feel like talking about the accident. Gargan was an embarrassment and a potential threat. To those who didn't know the real story, he was a puzzle wrapped in conspiratorial silence. But it was a silence that the senator had not demanded. Gargan wouldn't talk about the accident or the reason why it hadn't been reported for 10 hours. Because of his friendship and regard for Gargan, Paul Markham wasn't going to blow the whistle on Ted either. Markham told reporters, "I see no prospect of talking about it. Not today, not tomorrow, not the next day. I see no necessity of talking about it ever." Gargan says that his objection to Ted Kennedy doing this broadcast was just that he had been trained, keep your mouth shut, don't give your case away. Because the speech referred to his client, Joseph Donahue Jr., who Gargan had retained as his lawyer, read over the draft statement before it was delivered. Donahue found that it was acceptable in regard to his client's legal position. So he looks at it and tells Joey, "This does not put you in any legal jeopardy." But he urged Gargan to go personally to Ted Kennedy to dissuade him from delivering that speech. Donahue said, "Can't you get to him? Can't you tell him how damaging this is?" "We indicated our feelings, but others had theirs," Gargan says, "and it seemed to me they'd already made up their mind to go ahead with this explanation. We were not being asked for advice." And Gargan wants us to know that while the speech presented an accurate portrayal of the rescue effort that Gargan and Markham had made at Dyke Bridge, the rest of it was a fake. He said later, quote, "It was all made up, all of it, including thoughts and emotions." Wow. So our chapter 3 observations are so many things that have happened in this chapter. The reporters were expecting more info, but they get nothing. Ted Kennedy's sentence doesn't follow the minimum sentencing. Ted Kennedy's probation and restrictions are atypically free. Gwen Kopechne's concern is, what will Ted say about Mary Jo's character and reputation? We find out that Ted Kennedy's license had been fixed by McLaughlin and Joe Grealish. Gargan is now persona non grata with the Kennedy compound. Gargan and Markham were silent by choice. Gargan's lawyer, Donahue, urges Gargan to dissuade Ted from giving this speech. Finally, this speech, according to Gargan, is nearly all fake. Huge. All right, we're on to chapter 31. Because the senator's address was regarded as a news story, all 3 television networks donated 15 minutes of prime time to the broadcast. Among reporters who had stood a week's vigil waiting the release of a statement was Herald Traveler Stringer, Francis Broadhurst. Broadhurst proposed that he masquerade as a member of the television crew to observe the speech firsthand and then write a background story, including that information. Broadhurst was outraged when Clancy vetoed the idea. He says, "I was pretty disillusioned that the Kennedys could exercise so much control over the press." Yeah, welcome to the party, buddy. No reporter was being allowed inside the house. The senator was not going to answer any questions after his speech. An audio technician, Don Moore, was arranged to come. He had been chosen as part of a crew of 5. Facilities for the broadcast were going to be set up at the senator's house, but as they drive up, they measure the distance between 2 pillars in the driveway, and the remote truck couldn't get through. So the location of the speech is moved to the home of Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, Ted's dad. It was a race against time to install the hookup of television lines necessary to deliver picture and sound from Cape Cod via Providence, Rhode Island, to New York, where then networks would distribute the program nationwide at 7:30. That was when the senator was scheduled to deliver his speech. By 7:20, the crew got a picture. 5 minutes later, the audio came through. CBS was in the middle of broadcasting the nightly news with Walter Cronkite. The program featured an interview with Dr. Donald Mills. He's discussing the autopsy. He's sharing that the decision not to perform an autopsy on Mary Jo Kopechne had been jointly made with the DA's office. At the conclusion of the interview, Mills receives a call from said DA, Edmund Denise. He said, "Mills, you let me down by not ordering an autopsy." He started to scream over the telephone about what a liar I was, how incompetent I was, and worse. When he launched into a personal attack, my wife picked up the extension phone and screamed right back. I won't tell you exactly what he said. That's what Mills said. But he hung up the receiver in my face. A light layer of pancake makeup was being applied to the senator's face to dull a surface reflection of lights. Kennedy asks his mother to join Stephen Smith, along with his sisters Jean and Patricia, in a room off the library to watch the speech on television. Joan Kennedy is hanging around. She's more persistent until she is also ordered from the room by a short-tempered and tense Senator Kennedy. I just want to point out his love of his life, Helga Wagner, had been called and updated immediately before even Chief Arena knew that the accident had happened. His mistress, Helga, knew about it. Jonesy was in bed when a bevy of campaign people come into her home, and she's awakened by their voices in her home without her even realizing that any of it had happened. This woman who has stood by him as he's gone to the funeral, who has gone to the court with him, is now being ordered out of the room for his statement. The way he treats his wife is abominable. Absolutely abominable. Kennedy took a place behind a desk. The desk and chair had been built up using books to make it higher so that the cameras would be delivered at eye level. So he's able to, instead of, like I'm doing, leaning on the desk a little bit, he's able to sit really nice and upright and give a more natural angle when Kennedy delivered his speech. On cue from Moore, Kennedy begins reading from a manuscript that he has gripped tightly in his hands. I would urge you either now pause this video and go watch it, or right after we're done, go and watch Kennedy's address in this moment. It's on YouTube. It's widely available. You can watch the exact statement that he gave. I'm not going to read all of it, but I will read some critical parts. And remember, while I'm reading, that Joey Gargan says all of this, ironically, except his and Paul Markham's rescue attempts. Do with that what you will. But he says that part's not fake, but everything else in this speech, all of it, is fake. My fellow citizens, I've requested this opportunity to talk to you, the people of Massachusetts, about the tragedy which happened last Friday evening. So he explains his plea of guilty and then says, by way of explanation, on the weekend of July 18th, I was on Martha's Vineyard, participating in the annual Edgartown Sailing Regatta. Only reasons of health prevented my wife from accompanying me. I attended on Friday evening, July 18th, a cookout I had encouraged and helped sponsor for a group of devoted Kennedy campaign secretaries. When I left the party around 11:15 p.m., I was accompanied by one of these girls, Miss Mary Jo Kopechne. Mary Jo was one of the most devoted members of the staff of Senator Robert Kennedy. That's true. She worked for him for 4 years and was broken up over his death. That's also true. For this reason, and because she was such a gentle, kind, and idealistic person, all of us tried to help her feel that she still had a home with the Kennedy family. There is no truth whatever to the widely circulated suspicions of immoral conduct that have been leveled at my behavior and hers regarding that evening. There has never been a private relationship between us of any kind. I know nothing of Mary Jo's conduct on that or any other occasion, and the same is true of the other girls at the party that would lend any substance to any such speculation about their character. Nor was I driving under the influence of liquor. I just thought, you guys, he tucks that in there in the shadow of Mary Jo. He's talking about Mary Jo for a super long time. Out of what we've read, more than half of it has been about Mary Jo. And then he just slips in this little, nor was I under the influence of any alcohol. I feel like this is like very masterful. Like, you've already believed all these wonderful things about Mary Jo, so let me just tell you this other thing that I want you to believe to be true. A little over a mile away, the car that I was driving on an unlit road went off a narrow bridge, which had no guardrails and was built on a left angle to the road. I mean, the way he's written this, and he's not the one who wrote it. His lawyers wrote it. But the way he's written it, little over a mile away from what? The car that I was driving, I guess he means from the cottage. The car that I was driving on an unlit road went off a narrow bridge, not I drove off. This is a very, very, very passive way to communicate this information. He says the car overturned into a deep pond and immediately filled with water. I remembered thinking as the cold water rushed in around my head that I was for certain drowning. Then water entered my lungs, and I actually felt a sensation of drowning. But somehow I struggled to the surface, alive. I made immediate and repeated efforts to save Mary Jo by diving into the strong and murky current, but succeeded only in increasing my state of utter exhaustion and alarm. My conduct and conversation during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, made no sense to me at all. Although my doctors informed me that I suffered a cerebral concussion as well as shock, this is not what the doctors diagnosed, by the way, I do not seek to escape responsibility for my actions by placing the blame either on the physical and emotional trauma brought on by the accident or on anyone else. I mean, I just wrote, ha 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 ha. He totally did. He has been trying for a long time to place the blame on his shock and trauma and on Mary Jo. That was his hope in delaying the whole time. I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident. Yeah, you should. Instead of looking directly for a telephone, after lying exhausted on the grass for an undetermined time, I walked back to the cottage where the party was being held. Lying exhausted on the grass for an undetermined time. He's got to pack his narrative full of moments like this, multiple rescue attempts, laying on the grass for an undetermined time to make his 11:15 time fit at all. Because Huck looks on him at 12:45, so he's got an hour and a half to make up. Get a lot of time to make up, so you got to do some multiple rescue attempts. You got to lay on the grass. You got to fill the time, buddy. He says that he requested the help of Joey and Paul. Then he says all kinds of scrambled thoughts, all of them confused, some of them irrational, many of which I cannot recall, and some of which I would not have seriously entertained under normal circumstances, went through my mind during this period. Now, to me, this is implying that he was suicidal. And this is a subtle attempt to elicit sympathy. I went through all these terrible things and I just felt so awful and everything about me. He says, I was overcome, I am frank to say, by a jumble of emotions, grief, fear, doubt, exhaustion, panic, confusion, and shock. I'm frank to say. This is like when somebody answers every question with, well, honestly, well, to be honest, he's saying, well, I'm being very frank with you. Here, a list. It's almost like he pulled out his thesaurus and was like, here's all the things I could have been feeling in that moment. Let's just list all of them. The ferry having shut down for the night, I suddenly jumped into the water and impulsively swam across, nearly drowning once again in the effort, returning to my hotel at around 2 a.m. and collapsed in my room. This last week has been an agonizing one for me and for the members of my family, and the grief we feel over the loss of a wonderful friend that will remain with us for the rest of our lives. So everything's about him and his family. What about Mary Jo and her family, sir? Kennedy puts aside that prepared text and then he folds his hands and looks at the camera as if he's really speaking earnestly now to the people of Massachusetts. But what he's doing is reading from note cards that Joey Gargan is now holding for him right there under the camera. It looks like he's speaking extemporaneously, which is such a Ted Kennedy move. He looks like he's doing one thing, but what he's doing has been totally prepared by other people. It's not his own thoughts. It's not his own off-the-cuff desire to make a case to the people of Massachusetts. He then appeals to the people of Massachusetts, says that these events have raised the question in his mind of whether or not his standing among the people would allow him to continue to serve. I mean, it's not raised the question in your mind, Senator Kennedy. It's raised the question in everyone else's minds. But Senator Kennedy, the only thing we've heard from him is, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Can you believe it, Joe? Can you believe it? And then nothing. Mostly a bunch of babyish laying around and refusing to talk to anybody. He says he understands full well why some people think it's right for him to resign. And he says this is his decision to make, and it would be a difficult decision. He says, I ask you tonight, the people of Massachusetts, to think through this with me. In facing this decision, I seek your advice and opinion. In making it, I seek your prayers. I pray that I can have the courage to make the right decision. He gets up from the desk and he went to the adjoining room to watch commentary delivered by ABC News. The speech hit hard at the charge of manslaughter. It did so through the outright denial of drunk driving, a reaffirmation of his efforts to save Mary Jo, fortified by the new revelation that there had been an attempt by Gargan and Markham that had not been said prior to this. While it wasn't prosecutable, Kennedy also denied in this speech any sexual misconduct. This was the underlying issue that represented so many people's concerns and a serious threat to his political career. Richard Goodwin, an advisor, says they were trying to say something and still avoid the connotation of immorality, the old Irish Catholic fear of ever suggesting that you were screwing anybody outside of marriage. So they aren't even saying that. They just kind of imply it and say that, I'm denying outright that there's any form of that. A week of conferences had failed to fill the gap of 10 hours. And despite a disclaimer, Kennedy actually was still clinging to shock and exhaustion. By pleading guilty to leaving the scene of the accident, in the eyes of the law, he had forfeited his medical defense, but in the eyes of the public, he's appealing to it. Furthermore, no doctor had ever given him that diagnosis. Kennedy's escape at the landing had been transformed into an effort to swim to Edgartown, so strenuous that it incapacitated his ability to report the accident. This, of course, fails to explain why Mary Jo should have been left immersed for 10 hours while the senator weighs his scrambled thoughts. It also fails to calculate that he actually did speak with someone. So if he was good enough to speak to the hotel clerk, he could have gone and sounded an alarm and then collapsed into bed, right? He could have gone and gotten help for Mary Jo. In wondering whether somehow the awful weight of this incredible incident might in some way pass from my shoulders, which he did admit in this statement, Kennedy actually came close to expressing the hope that somebody else might take the blame for the accident. Kennedy had asked for a vote of confidence from the people of Massachusetts. Time magazine later notes he asked to shoulder the blame of what happened, while at the same time he was obviously begging to be excused. Amidst the fabrication, one poignant truth surfaced in the speech. Gargan knows the reality behind the health reasons that had prevented Joan from attending the party. He says she was having a very tentative pregnancy and was trying to stay as quiet as possible in order to keep the baby. She wasn't expected to go to Edgartown this particular sailing weekend, and instead she's had to travel for a funeral and for a court case. She's going in by boat and coming out by plane. This woman has had so much dang stress in her life from Ted Kennedy. Minutes after the speech, telephone calls began to pour in. We got through 100 calls in a half hour, Dick Drain says. That's his press secretary in Washington. We would have had more, but people couldn't even get through. And the response to the speech was overwhelmingly favorable. The Kennedy political apparatus was not relying on the spontaneous eruption of public opinion alone to persuade the senator to remain in office. Other reactions had been lined up. Senator Mike Mansfield thought that Kennedy's speech had answered all his critics. Another fellow Democrat, Congressman Edward Boland of Massachusetts, hoped that ugly rumors had now been put to rest. He says, knowing Senator Kennedy as I do, and also having known Mary Jo Kopechne, I am convinced there was no kind of improper relationship between them. Kennedy's position in the Senate had not been damaged by the accident, said Tip O'Neill, who would later go on to become the House Speaker. He said, I say that Senator Kennedy can still be an effective leader. We need him badly. 1 hour after the speech, Gwen Chappaquiddick steps onto the porch of a neighbor to read haltingly from a handwritten text. I'm satisfied with the senator's statement and do hope he stays on in the Senate. Later, she explained, I was satisfied that he came forward and said anything. Before that, I was going out of my mind. Questions? There are a lot of questions. That's what I go on from day to day, the unanswered questions. In the week that the senator had been in seclusion from his advisors, he had also maintained just as calculated a silence with the Kopechnes as he had with the press. Mrs. Kopechne said the only people who told us anything were the reporters. Nobody else told us what was going on. They seemed to forget about Mary Jo, as though she didn't count. I mean, yes, of course she felt this way, and I just thought, even more so because the one moment in time when she would have been assured of how many people loved and admired and thought well of her daughter, she was sedated during the funeral. And I'm not judging her for that. I'm just saying she didn't have the presence of mind to recall those things that people had said that would have been meaningful. Having gone through a couple of recent losses in our family, I know I go back to those moments and recall how many people loved our loved ones, how many people were there, how many people had meaningful stories to share. And those things are very comforting to family members in their grief. She didn't have that because she deliberately didn't want to remember those moments. And so she feels like Mary Jo has been forgotten and doesn't count. And I'm not saying that she's not valid in doing so. Ted Kennedy's actions have certainly made her feel this way. But at the funeral, the Boiler Room girls, Joey Gargan and others had communicated how important Mary Jo was to them and how much they thought of her. But she doesn't remember any of that. The Kopechnes no longer felt that an autopsy of their daughter was necessary. George Killen says, you'd have thought he was running for re-election in the midst of all of this. He didn't explain a GD thing about the accident. If that's all he was going to say, he'd have been better off saying nothing at all. Killen shares that dissatisfaction. Bernie Flynn explains, all this time, Killen's telling Denise, stay out of it. Let them handle it. Kennedy's going to give all the details. We don't have to get involved. And then this speech just pulled the rug out from those arguments. Flynn was convinced that Senator Kennedy had lied in his police report. Watching that speech, I'm saying to myself, this GD guy is lying again. He should never have gone on the air. The speech was an insult to your intelligence. Whoever came up with that speech ought to be shot. Here's Chapter 31's observations. Ted's speech was broadcast as news. No news reporters were in the room, and there was no Q&A. The Kennedys watched from a different room. Ted reads a long speech, and then cue cards. The speech was passive. It admitted some things and also appealed to other things that could not have gone together with a guilty plea. Ted Kennedy both accepts blame and also lists all of the evidence why he shouldn't be to blame. But he comes right short of asking the people to acquit him. Ultimately, it was a political plea to Massachusetts voters. The response from the voters and public officials was overwhelmingly favorable. Gwen and Jo Kopechne make a statement, and they are both barely satisfied. Killen and Flynn feel angry and think that Ted Kennedy lied. And we will stop there. Next time we will continue on with Chapter 32. I hope you guys are enjoying this. Today's episode of going through the court case and then hearing Ted Kennedy's statement, we got a lot of progress through the events that have happened thus far. We are a few pages shy of halfway, so good job us. I hope this gave you lots of meaty, interesting things to think about and chew on as you decide alongside me what we think actually happened on Chappaquiddick in 1969 and whether or not any of it matches what this man says about it. I'm enjoying these discussions and I hope you are too. Y'all have a great day. Bye.